Imagine you're putting together a crew to build a massive suspension bridge in your city.
Okay, a massive bridge. Got it.
Right, and you spend years focused entirely on the hiring process. You run exhaustive background checks.
Yeah, of course.
You verify union certifications, hold intense public hearings, and you make sure the lead contractor is fairly elected by the community. You build this incredibly rigorous, perfectly transparent system to guarantee that the people building the bridge have the absolute undisputed right to be there.
So the crew is, by every definition, perfectly legitimate.
Exactly. Completely legitimate. But then they start building and the bridge just collapses on day one.
Oh, wow. So what went wrong?
Well, because while you spent a decade verifying who got to build it, nobody was ever assigned to calculate the actual laws of physics.
Right. Nobody checked the blueprints.
Yeah, nobody checked what the blueprints would actually do in the real world. And that bridge analogy, well, it's not mine. It's the core idea of this really fascinating essay by Elias Kunis called Legitimacy Came Before Cognition, which is the single text we are diving into today.
And it is a fantastic piece to unpack.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to understand a massive blind spot in how modern societies govern themselves. We're going to explore why our, beautifully evolved democracies are obsessed with who gets to make the rules, but surprisingly terrible at predicting what those rules will actually trigger once they're passed.
Yeah, and it sounds almost absurd when you frame it around a physical bridge, right?
Totally.
I mean, you would never separate the authority to build from the knowledge of whether the structure will actually stand up.
Yeah.
Yet, when you step into the world of modern governance and statecraft, that separation is basically the default operating system.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Human civilization has spent millennia perfecting legitimacy, the right to decide. But we've left cognition, the actual understanding of the consequence of the decision, completely fragmented.
So it's not just some dry political science theory then?
Not at all.
Yeah.
The author here is giving us a diagnostic tool. This essay offers a new lens to look at baffling government decisions and realize that, hey, things don't always break because of corruption or malice. Sometimes they break because of this exact structural void.
Okay, let's unpack this with a very real, very expensive example from the text, because I think it grounds this abstract idea immediately.
Yeah, let's get into the Finland case.
Right, so we are looking at Finland in June of 2022. Now, Finland is highly developed, incredibly low corruption, highly legitimate. Right?
Absolutely. One of the best.
But overnight, their statistical authority made this seemingly minor technical reclassification regarding state-subsidized housing loans. They basically shifted which ledger these loans sat on.
A paperwork update, essentially.
Exactly. And that single paperwork update added 15 billion euros, which, by the way, later rose to about 20 billion euros, to Finland's official headline public debt.
Which is just a staggering number. And we really have to look at the mechanics of what actually happened there.
Right, because it wasn't real money being spent, right?
Exactly. Those loans were not new money being printed or thrown into a void. They were secured by real estate and were being systematically repaid through tenant rents. The economic reality on the ground had not changed one bit.
So what triggered it?
Well, Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, provided a new interpretation of how these things should be categorized. And by shifting those loans from a separate housing bucket into the main government debt tab, the downstream effects were just immediate and severe.
To put this in everyday terms for you listening, imagine getting a letter in the mail saying your mortgage has been technically reclassified by your bank. Your house hasn't changed, your income hasn't changed, but suddenly your credit score is completely destroyed.
Right. It happens right at the worst possible time.
Yeah. It happens at the exact moment you are trying to take out a loan to fix a collapsing roof. For Finland, this paperwork glitch instantly tightened their fiscal rules. It made using their primary counter-cyclical housing tools completely, politically toxic.
And we should probably define what those counter-cyclical tools are, because that is where the real damage actually occurs.
Yeah, go for it.
So when a private housing market enters a recession and private developers stop building, a government usually steps in with these tools to keep construction workers employed and keep the housing supply steady.
So it goes against the cycle.
Exactly. Hence, counter-cyclical. Now, Finland was entering a housing construction recession. They desperately needed to use those tools. But because their official debt suddenly looked 20 billion euros heavier, doing so became politically impossible. Austerity kicked in precisely when stimulus was needed.
Wow. But wait, I want to push back on the sequence of events here, though.
Yeah.
The essay points out a striking detail about the Netherlands.
Right, the Netherlands comparison.
Yeah, because the Netherlands has a very similar housing setup. But when faced with the exact same European interpretation, the Netherlands contested it for 10 years to protect their housing market. Finland just accepted it in 3 years.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
So if the Finnish authorities knew this was going to be a 20 billion euro disaster that would cripple their housing stimulus, why didn't anyone hit the brakes?
What's fascinating here is that nobody hit the brakes because nobody was legally tasked with looking at the disaster.
Wait, really?
Really, the essay's central thesis is perfectly illustrated here. No Finnish institution owned the question of what would actually happen.
So nobody was responsible for the physics of the bridge.
Exactly. The Director General of Statistics Finland, Markus Savala, he did his exact job. His mandate is to classify transactions according to European criteria impartially.
Right.
He is specifically not supposed to weigh the political or economic outcomes of doing so because, that would compromise his statistical independence.
Oh, I see. So the politicians couldn't intervene without violating the agency's independence, and the agency couldn't intervene because predicting market fallout just isn't their job.
That is the core mechanism of the failure right there. Every single actor in this chain was operating entirely within their assigned role. It was procedurally legitimate.
But completely blind.
Yes. The function of mapping out the structural consequences, the cognition, was owned by absolutely no one. The decision was entirely legitimate, but it was cognitively ownerless.
Okay, so if this gap is so incredibly obvious and it causes 20 billion euro headaches over simple ledger updates, why on earth did human civilization evolve this way? I mean, we're a smart species. How did we get so good at the who and so bad at the what happens next?
It really comes down to the brutal evolutionary pressure on early societies. The author breaks this down into the asymmetry of fast versus slow death.
Fast versus slow death. Okay.
Yeah. Think about legitimacy failures historically. They are incredibly fast, highly visible, and totally existential. If a monarch dies without a clear succession protocol or a military usurper tries to take the throne, the society doesn't just suffer a mild economic dip.
No, you get a civil war in a matter of weeks.
Exactly. The elites experience the pain of that failure almost immediately. Economic paralysis, open rebellion, lethal consequences for the people in power.
Right, you lose your head.
Literally.
Yeah.
Any society that couldn't figure out a system to clearly, indisputably answer who has the right to decide was quickly wiped out or conquered by its neighbors.
So the ones that survived were forced to figure it out.
Yes, they evolved heavy, durable machinery to ensure legitimate transitions of power. Over 2 millennia, we built what the essay calls the legitimacy stack. Roman constitutional law, the evolution of the English Parliament, complex judicial review system.
We have massive, enduring institutional memory for how to transfer power. So basically, we perfected legitimacy because bad legitimacy kills you today. And we neglected cognition because bad cognition kills you tomorrow.
That is exactly the dividing line. Cognition failures are slow, they're distributed. The author calls them attribution poor.
What does that mean, attribution poor?
It means it's hard to pin the blame on one specific thing. If your government uses a flawed policy theory or fails to model a demographic constraint properly, nobody marches on the Capitol the next morning. It just means that over the next 40 years, productivity grows a little slower, housing gets a little tighter, innovation stalls.
And crucially, the cause and effect are totally decoupled for the politician, right? By the time anyone realizes the economy is stagnant, the person who signed the rule into law has been retired for 20 years. They're entirely insulated from the fallout.
Exactly. The cost is absorbed by future generations, meaning the immediate selection pressure to build institutions that map consequences simply wasn't there.
But, we should clarify that older empires weren't completely blind to this.
Oh, really? Yeah, the non-European traditions handled it differently. The author points to the Chinese imperial examinations or the Ottoman Defter ledgers.
Oh, right.
Those systems did have rigorous cognition. They heavily tested officials on administration and kept really detailed, long-term economic accounts.
But the text makes a distinction about how permanent those systems were, right? Like, they had smart people, but did they have smart institutions?
And that is the fatal flaw the author identifies. In those older traditions, the cognition was tied to the individual official. It wasn't baked into the state apparatus as an enduring, independent public model.
So if the wise official died,
or fell out of favor or moved to a different province, the consequence mapping ability just vanished with them.
Wow. Okay, bringing this back to the modern day, though, It's not like our current governments don't collect data. I mean, we are absolutely drowning in data. We have massive census bureaus, endless economic charts, predictive algorithms. We clearly care about information.
We do care about data, yeah. But the modern state fragmented the processing of that data into incomplete pieces. The essay breaks this down into 4 distinct silos.
Okay, that's the first one.
The first is descriptive cognition. Think of your national statistics bureaus or the census. They are phenomenal at telling us what is currently happening. They measure inflation, employment rates, births, imports.
But they fundamentally do not tell us what a proposed decision will do in the future.
All right.
They're basically reading the thermometer to tell you it's hot outside today, but they aren't predicting tomorrow's weather, let alone telling you how to build a better air conditioner.
Great analogy. And that brings us to the second silo, retrospective cognition. These are the auditors, the courts, the special parliamentary inquiries. They do look at consequences, but only in the rearview mirror.
Oh, I see. The people who show up with clipboards after the bridge has already collapsed.
Exactly. And consider the timing problem there. By the time an auditor publishes a brilliant, 500-page autopsy report detailing exactly why a policy failed, the budget has been spent. The ribbons have been cut. The political capital is long gone.
So retrospective cognition is vital for history, but it doesn't map the consequence before the decision is made. It can't prevent the harm.
Precisely.
I see what you mean, though. The text actually frames a third category that seems to contradict this. The essay talks about bounded oracles like fiscal councils and central banks.
Yes.
Wait, don't central banks predict consequences all the time? They run massive simulations on what will happen if they raise interest rates by 0.25%. They are literally predicting the future to guide their present decisions.
They do, and they are highly effective at it. But the essay argues they are the exception that proves the rule.
How so?
Central banks are only allowed to exist and wield that predictive power because their mandate is incredibly narrow and heavily fenced in. They're isolated to monetary stability or financial resilience.
Oh, I get it.
Politicians tolerate these bounded oracles, specifically because their boundary is highly defined. They don't weigh in on healthcare policy or infrastructure.
Which naturally sets up the contrast with the fourth silo, adversarial cognition. Things like intelligence assessments, military planning, and wargaming.
Yes.
We spend billions running complex simulations on what an adversary might do if we move troops to a certain border.
Right. And connecting that to the bigger picture, adversarial cognition proves that modern states absolutely possess the technical capability to build brilliant cross-domain consequence models.
We do it for the military constantly.
Exactly. And the reason we do it is the feedback loop. When the threat is an enemy army, the consequences of a bad model are immediate and lethal. Borders move. Soldiers die. The state feels the pain instantly.
Just synthesizing those silos, we have all these isolated fragments. We can predict consequences when survival pressure is fast like an enemy invasion, or when the mandate is tiny like setting interest rates. We just completely failed to generalize this machinery to everyday domestic mechanism design. We don't wargame our welfare systems. We don't run thousands of simulations on our housing zoning laws before we pass them.
Exactly. We have independent prediction, but we lack full-spectrum, cross-domain accounting for everyday governance. And the essay doesn't just theorize about this gap. It actually measures it.
Right.
It provides a computational proof of just how deep this ownerless void really is.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the sheer scale of the problem becomes undeniable. The author looks at a computational graph of Finland's public legal database.
Yeah, the numbers here are wild.
They really are. So Finland has about 59,000 in-force statutes. When you map the connections between them computationally, the numbers are just staggering. Roughly 34,000 cross-statute citations are completely stale.
Wow.
Yeah. They point to legal norms or versions that have moved, changed, or just vanished entirely.
It's just the residue of past decisions piling up without any maintenance.
And it gets worse. About 44% of active decrees are authorizing themselves under statutes that have already been repealed.
So the foundation they rest on is literally gone.
Exactly. And perhaps the most telling metric, there are 184 unexercised mandatory delegations.
We should probably translate what that actually means in practice, because it's a pretty bizarre legal concept.
Yeah, basically, these are laws where the legislature explicitly wrote, the government must build this mechanism or set up this regulatory body. But the mechanism was never actually built, yet the legal entitlement still exists in the code.
The ghost of the law still haunts the books.
Yes. If you're a software engineer, you know exactly what this is. This is spaghetti code. Or if you are just a regular computer user listening to this, imagine opening up your PC's registry and finding thousands of files pointing to software you deleted a decade ago.
It's the institutional technical debt of the state.
Exactly.
And think about how that impacts the average citizen. When you wonder why getting a local building permit takes 3 years, or why your taxes fund redundant bureaucratic loops, you are feeling the friction of those 34,000 stale citations. The machinery is clogged with dead links.
And the essay points out a really fascinating modern twist here. With today's technology, a single developer using artificial intelligence could build a program to spot all of these broken legal links in a matter of weeks.
Right.
So the bottleneck here isn't technical anymore. We have the computing power to map this terrain easily.
The bottleneck is purely ownerlessness. No single institution is tasked with repairing the whole surface. No one owns the architecture of consequences as a whole.
Right.
You have thousands of individual lawmakers and agencies adding to the code, but nobody's responsible for compiling it and making sure it actually runs.
Okay, but I'm stuck on this idea of a consequence office, though. If we have the technology to map consequences, and we clearly know that the lack of it is actively hurting us, costing billions of euros and filling our legal code with dead links, why don't we just build an institution that owns this today?
Well, the author points to what he calls the political tolerance ceiling.
The political tolerance ceiling.
Yeah. Politicians, by their very nature, resist institutions that would bind their decisions across multiple domains before they spend their political capital. If you want to pass a highly popular, emotionally resonant bill, the absolute last thing you want is an independent office publishing a highly credible model showing that your bill will cause massive secondary damage to the supply chain.
Oh, I see. It strips away their ability to sell a clean narrative.
Yes. And when public outrage over a failure does force institutions to respond, say after a massive financial crash or a huge policy disaster, they rarely build real cognition engines. The author references Michael Power's book, The Audit Society.
Okay, what does he say?
When forced to react, mature institutions default to rituals of verification.
How does a ritual of verification differ from actually fixing the problem?
Good question. A ritual of verification is creating more transparency reports, setting up new oversight boards, or building massive compliance checklists. It gives the illusion of accountability.
Right.
But it leaves the underlying structural power dynamics entirely intact. It is ceremonial. It doesn't actually map the consequences of the next decision. It just creates an exponentially larger pile of paperwork for the last one.
Wow. And even when we do have independent bodies trying to provide hard data, they're incredibly fragile when they bump up against political realities.
Definitely.
The essay brings up an impartial case study from early 2025, the firing of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Commissioner Erica McIntyre. She was let go over weak jobs numbers and downward revisions. Just to be clear to you listening, we're impartially reporting what the source discusses here, but it's a very striking example.
It is. And looking at that strictly through the analytical lens of the essay, it illustrates the exact vulnerability of fragmented cognition organs. Statistical independence was originally designed to prevent that kind of interference.
Right.
But when the independent data clashes directly with the political narrative a leader needs to survive, the political tolerance ceiling comes crashing down. The organ is either ignored, defunded, or its leadership is replaced.
Here is where I really struggle with the author's solution, though. If we did manage to build a powerful, centralized consequence office that could model out everything, if they have the power to say this law will fail, don't they effectively become the real politician?
That's a huge concern, yeah.
Wouldn't that just lead to a bunch of unelected nerds, statisticians vetoing the government? Why would voters ever accept what is essentially a technocracy?
And that is the strongest principled objection to this whole concept. If an unelected body's models legally bind the political process, then the legitimate decider, the elected official the voters actually chose, has been displaced.
Right, which defeats the purpose of democracy.
Exactly. But the author counters this using the design constraints outlined by historical thinkers like F.A. Hayek and James C. Scott.
Okay, remind me. Hayek focused heavily on the knowledge problem, right? The idea that no central planner can ever know enough to manage a complex society.
Yes.
And Scott warned against the dangers of high modernist planning, where states try to force reality to fit their neat, oversimplified grids.
Spot on. So taking those constraints seriously means a proper cognition layer cannot be an omniscient central planner. It cannot suffer from the fantasy that its models are perfect. Its job is to map the terrain, not to choose the destination.
I like that distinction. Map at the terrain, don't choose the destination.
Exactly. A true mechanism cognition organ must publish its assumptions loudly. It must explicitly state its uncertainties and its margins of error. It has to highlight the variables it is actively excluding from the model.
So it's not standing at the door saying, you cannot pass this law. It's standing there with a map saying, if you pass this law, here is the causal path of what will break over the next 10 years. Here is why we think that, and here is our 15% margin of error.
And that preserves the legitimacy stack.
Yeah.
Legitimacy still makes the final call. The elected officials still vote. But they do so with the mechanism visible to everyone, including the voters.
Which changes the dynamic entirely.
Exactly. We already do this with the bounded oracles. Fiscal councils publish models that constrain politics through public credibility. If a fiscal council says a budget will bankrupt the country, the politicians can still legally pass it, but they have to answer to the public for ignoring the math.
Ah, I see.
The missing piece is just taking that exact same principle of public credibility and applying it to everything else. Welfare systems, artificial intelligence governance, infrastructure, legal architecture.
So what does this all mean? If we synthesize this whole journey we've been on today, what is the core takeaway for you, the listener? Whether you're analyzing risk decisions at your business, looking at how your local city council operates, or just trying to navigate the daily complexities of modern governance, you have to recognize this fundamental imbalance.
Yeah, it's everywhere once you see it.
It really is. We are a species hyper-focused on who has the authority to make a call. We will spend endless energy, billions of dollars, and years of our lives debating the legitimacy of the decision maker. And yet we are alarmingly blind to mapping out what that call will actually trigger once it leaves their desk.
We don't have to be.
Right. We have the data. We have the raw computational power, but we lack the institutional owner. The missing puzzle piece in modern governance is public, decision-coupled, cross-domain mechanism cognition.
The empowering part of this essay is realizing that a legitimate decision does not have to be cognitively ownerless anymore. The technical bottleneck is gone.
AI can map the spaghetti code.
Exactly.
Nah.
We no longer have the excuse that the world is too complex to model. The tools to map the terrain exist right now on our servers. It is purely a matter of institutional willpower to build the machinery that actually uses them.
But I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own as we wrap up. We spend a lot of time assuming that governments naturally want better predictions so they can make better policies for everyone. We assume the intent is there, but the tools are just lacking.
Right, we assume they want to know.
Exactly. But consider the survival instincts of an elected official. What if political survival actually relies on a lack of foresight? Think about it. If a perfect consequence mapping machine existed, would politicians actively refuse to use it?
It's a scary thought.
It is, because knowing the exact consequences ahead of time strips away their most valuable shield, plausible deniability. If that suspension bridge collapses and the physics report was published, peer-reviewed, and ignored beforehand, they are fully, undeniably responsible for the fallout. And maybe, just maybe, they would rather build the bridge in the dark.